The door was not locked, and I understood immediately that this was going to be a problem, not because it made leaving easier, but because it removed the excuse I had been relying on, the simple mechanical reason that would have allowed me to stop trying, to stop standing there, to stop asking myself why nothing felt different even when everything appeared to be working as it should. I checked it carefully the first time, fingers wrapping around the handle, turning it slowly, almost respectfully, waiting for resistance that never came, for the familiar stiffness of a locked door, but the handle moved freely. The latch released without sound, and the door opened a few centimeters, revealing the same light on the other side, unchanged, flat, and strangely continuous. I closed it again immediately, not because I was afraid, but because the absence of effort felt incorrect, as if something important had been skipped. And when I opened it a second time, wider now, the result was identical, the space beyond offering no clear sense of transition, no feeling of crossing from one place into another, only more of what was already there. There was no sound coming from the other side, no change in temperature, no shift in air pressure. Details I only noticed because of how strongly I had expected them, how prepared I had been for the door to behave like a door, to perform its role and divide one space from another in a way that felt meaningful. I stood at the threshold longer than I intended, 1 foot forward and 1 foot still behind me, waiting for the moment to clarify itself, for the situation to tell me whether stepping through was correct or unnecessary. But nothing responded, and the silence felt deliberate rather than empty, as if waiting itself was part of what I was supposed to be doing. Eventually, I stepped through. There was no sensation of arrival. The floor beneath my feet felt exactly the same. The walls maintained the same distance, and the light continued without interruption, making it impossible to tell whether I had entered a new space or simply repositioned myself within the same one. Now standing somewhere else without having actually gone anywhere. I turned around immediately to look back at the door, half expecting it to have closed behind me or disappeared. But it remained exactly where it had been, open, ordinary, and intact, offering no indication that anything significant had just happened. I tested it again from this side, opening and closing it slowly, then a little faster, listening carefully for a variation, for any sign that repetition might produce a different result. But every movement felt identical to the last, smooth, silent, and inconclusive. After a while, I realized that I was no longer testing the door itself, but testing whether my actions still mattered, whether the environment acknowledged my participation at all. And when that thought settled in, the room felt subtly smaller, not physically, but in terms of possibility. I remained near the doorway, standing in a place that should have represented choice, yet offered none. And the longer I stayed there, the clearer it became that the option to leave had never been taken away, only stripped of relevance. I walked through the door again. Nothing changed. I walked back. Nothing changed. Each crossing felt less like movement and more like confirmation, reinforcing the idea that motion was allowed, but not rewarded, permitted without consequence, tolerated without recognition. At some point, I stopped keeping track of how many times I crossed the threshold because counting implied progress, and progress was no longer something I could verify, the room presenting itself the same way regardless of where I stood within it. I began to notice details I had ignored before, how the door frame did not cast a shadow the way it should have, how the light flattened depth and erased contrast, making it difficult to tell where the doorway ended and the surrounding wall began, as if the distinction itself was no longer important. I pressed my hand against the surface of the door, then against the wall beside it, searching for irregularities, for any indication that something was misaligned, but everything felt precise, consistent, and complete, offering no sign of malfunction. The realization did not arrive suddenly, but accumulated slowly through repetition, that the door was functioning exactly as intended, that nothing about it required fixing, and that its purpose was not to restrict access, but to demonstrate that access itself no longer carried meaning. I waited for the door to respond when I stepped away, to close on its own or to signal that my absence mattered. But it remained open behind me, unchanged, as if emphasizing that nothing had been resolved, that the condition I was in did not depend on barriers, but on something quieter and far more difficult to challenge. I stayed near the door longer than I realized, not because I expected it to change, but because stepping away from it felt like abandoning the last visible reference point I had, even though that reference had already proven itself useless. From where I stood, the doorway looked less like an exit and more like a frame, a shape preserved out of habit rather than necessity. And the longer I looked at it, the harder it became to remember why doors were supposed to matter in the first place. I tried positioning myself at different angles, standing directly in front of it, then slightly to the side, then close enough that my shoulder brushed the frame, as if proximity might trigger a response. But the space remained indifferent, offering no acknowledgement that my behavior had changed. At one point, I held the door halfway open and waited, keeping it suspended between closed and open, listening for any sound that might suggest strain or correction. But the hinge did not resist, the latch did not engage, and the moment remained incomplete, as though the concept of interruption no longer applied. The idea formed quietly, without urgency, that the door was not meant to resolve anything, that its presence served only to preserve the appearance of choice, long after choice itself had been removed. And once that thought settled, the room felt different, not smaller or darker, but more settled, as if it had reached a stable configuration. I realized then that nothing in this space reacted to intention, only to presence, and that even presence was tolerated rather than required, allowed without consequence, registered without response. When I finally stepped away from the doorway and stood elsewhere in the room, the door did not draw my attention back to it, did not assert itself, did not remind me of its existence, remaining open and unremarkable, as though it had already fulfilled its function simply by being there. I tried to recall the last moment when the idea of leaving had felt practical rather than symbolic, but the memory resisted definition, dissolving into a vague sense that the distinction had faded gradually, not as a result of failure, but as a result of repetition. Standing there, no longer facing the door, I became aware that the room did not orient itself around exits or boundaries, but around continuity, maintaining the same conditions regardless of where I stood or what I intended to do next. The door was still open. Nothing prevented me from walking through it again. And yet, for the first time since I had noticed it was unlocked, the idea of crossing the threshold felt unnecessary, not because I had given up, but because the action no longer promised a different result. The room remained stable. The conditions remained acceptable. And the presence of the door no longer suggested the possibility of change, only the persistence of the same outcome, repeated as many times as required.